Hey, everybody, and welcome to Climate Plus. This is a special edition of our podcast This Week in Global Development. We're talking all about COP29 in Baku, Azerbaijan. And I'm joined by our reporters, Chase-Lubitz and Ayenat Mersie. We're going to be on the ground in Baku to talk about all the issues that are discussed at the COP and to bring you some conversations with the leaders that are there. And we're starting now with a discussion before we get to Baku, just to give you a sense of what's to come. I'm going to start with you, Jesse. I've heard this is considered the finance COP. Is that right? And what is the idea behind this COP29?
Yeah, so that's right. This is considered the finance COP. COP29 is significant because this is the year that they will be updating the climate goals. So the last time they updated this was 2009. Now it's time to come up with a new financial goal. Just to give some context on that, the last one was $100 billion. They reached that. They reached that goal in 2022, although whether or not they really reached it is contentious. Now, so that's $100 billion annually. Now they will negotiate on a new annual goal.
I wondered how much those numbers mattered to begin with, Jesse. And then, of course, we had this week's election results in the United States. I always thought these numbers sound like what I call pledgeflation, where people are pledging big figures, but really, is it new money? Is it really grant dollars? Understanding what we meant by $100 billion in climate finance, as you said, was already tough. Now we're facing huge political headwinds in the U.S. A new president who really doesn't believe in climate change as a core issue, and similar right-leaning politics in many other donor countries in Western Europe. So I guess, does this mean that Baku, even before it begins, is set to fail? I mean, how should we look at it from a finance COP perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that it's set up to fail. I think whether we achieve these goals or not, making the pledges is important. There are a lot of questions around how the 100 billion was fulfilled, how much of it was in loans, how much of it was in grants, and climate finance is sort of it's accounted for differently than a lot of development aid. They include they don't use a grant equivalency, so we don't really know exactly how much is in grant money and how much is in loan money and whether that counts. As far as the U.S. election goes, it's going to be a big deal at this COP, and we're going to see the impacts. I imagine the U.S. is obviously one of the biggest donors, and the last time President-elect Trump was president, he pulled out of the Paris Agreement. He's likely to do so again, and if he does, obviously that's a huge lack of funding. So a lot of experts are worried that knowing he's coming into office could mean that the other big donors, the European Union and the United Kingdom, are a little bit less. They promise less into the funding, so we might see the effects already.
Yeah, the lack of U.S. leadership on funding could lead everybody else, sort of saying, well, we're not going to step up and fill that gap. We'll follow that lead. Ayenat, what are you hearing and seeing? What are you paying attention to? I know the big acronym at prior COPs was NDCs. What are those, and what should we be paying attention to?
Yes, and these will be a really big deal at this COP. So basically, NDC is the nationally determined contributions. So that just means each country's specific pledge about what they're going to do to mitigate emissions. And so these are short to medium term targets as to how each country can start to get towards that 1.5 degrees Celsius that we're all trying to work towards still. And so these commitments should include, specific targets, measures, timeframes, and these are updated every 5 years. And so the next batch of these is due in February. And so this is kind of the last in-person meeting that we're all going to have before we're going to have to submit those in February. And so there's going to be lots of questions about how ambitious these will have to be, because these will have to be a lot more ambitious than the last set of NDCs. If we were to just go by the last set of NDCs from 5 years ago, we would not really come close to 1.5 or even 2. I think the World Resource Institute estimated that it was somewhere between 2.5 and 2.9 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. So we have to really scale up the ambitiousness of these. And, there's also questions about what kinds of things these will include. So one really interesting thing is, will these start to take into consideration things like food system and agriculture? Will these take into account health, which is obviously something that we have to adapt towards? And so a lot of people will definitely be paying attention to these NDCs, which will be coming out. And some of them might even be announced at COP. We don't know for sure yet.
And I guess the mechanism of action here is what exactly? Because they're not really enforceable, are they? I mean, these are countries who are voluntarily putting forward an idea for how they're going to transition their own economy to be greener, reduce their carbon emissions. And then we kind of add them all up at a global level and say, well, what does it mean in terms of the warming of the earth? Maybe we can go to you, Jesse, just on, we've heard about NDCs, but there's a new acronym this year at this year's COP, which is related to climate finance. Tell us, what is that? What does it mean?
Yes. So everybody loves this acronym. It is the NCQG. That stands for the New Collective Quantified Goal. And that's what I was talking about before. That's our new financial goal. So that was and is currently at 100 billion a year. Now developing countries would like that to be at least 1 trillion, which is unlikely to happen, according to the people that I've spoken with. And this is where we're going to see, like I said earlier, the impact of the US election, because everybody has to come together and decide what to commit. But it's not just about how much we're committing. It's also about how it's going to be spent, who's going to pay for it, how it will be counted. And very little is known at this point about any of those questions.
And the NCQG, the new goals around finance, are connected in a lot of ways to the goals around climate for each country, because they need the finance in the global south, right, to find a way to transition their economy away from carbon. So although these two acronyms seem like they're separate issues, in a lot of ways they're ultimately connected. Is that right, Ayenat?
Yes, exactly. That's correct. So basically, a lot of developing countries are also kind of waiting around to see what is decided in the NCQGs, because that will really shape what they can do in terms of these national contributions. Like, they need to know how much is available to them before they start to make promises about what they can do.
Now, I know, thinking about finance again, there were a couple of new innovations in the last couple of COPs. We had a loss and damage fund that was created. There was an adaptation fund, especially given the election results in the United States, where the incoming president, Donald Trump, has already in his last administration pulled the U.S. out of contributing to the Green Climate Fund. I mean, doesn't it seem likely, Jesse, that these two funds are not going to have U.S. support? And what's the conversation? What are you going to be looking for when it comes to these two funds this year?
Yeah, so just to clarify, Loss and Damage Fund is new. The Adaptation Fund has actually been around for a while, but it's sort of underfunded. It's been underfunded for a long time. Adaptation's really tricky because a lot of countries would prefer to invest in mitigation that has a little bit more investment potential than adaptation. But on the loss and damage side, what everyone's really looking at is whether or not loss and damage is mentioned in the NCQG, the acronym that we were talking about earlier. Right now, the Paris Agreement legally mandates that countries have to put money towards adaptation and mitigation. But loss and damage is new. Like we said, it started this whole term kind of arose in Egypt originally in COP29. So it's not mandated. And a lot of countries are really pushing for that to be a part of the NCQG, because if it is, it kind of puts it on par with mitigation and adaptation. I'm not sure exactly how the election will affect that part of the conversation. I imagine in the same way that I mentioned before, which is that everybody's just going to be a little bit more frugal now, knowing that the U.S. is likely to step away.
Yeah, I think it also affects things in terms of two other areas. One is governance, and the other is the kind of aid architecture. Right? I mean, a lot of the reason why people were pushing for the loss and damage fund in the global south was they saw it as a fund they could control. Right? It was a fund that could have truly global governance, as opposed to the World Bank, which is a shareholding institution. Well, it's unlikely that this political turn in the US is going to lead toward wanting to give more voting authority over funds to the global South. If anything, is the opposite. So I think that's going to be a key question mark. Like, are we in a place now politically where the global South will have their demands met in terms of broad-based voting power over these kinds of international financial instruments? And then I think related to that is, are these really efficient? Is this an efficient way to work, to create new funds that have to have their own bureaucracy and their own board and their own procurement processes, et cetera, in an era of more tight belt tightening, in general? Maybe we end up seeing more consolidation of these kinds of funds, or just low enough support, like you were saying, for the adaptation fund, that really it becomes the MDBs and the DFIs that are bilateral that end up doing a lot of this mitigation adaptation work. And even arguments like loss and damage maybe just don't resonate in this kind of right-leaning political environment in the US and in Europe.
Yeah, I mean, I spoke with the people at the Adaptation Fund recently, and they kind of made that point too. We don't need more funds. We have the infrastructure for these things. Even if the NCQG, they decide to kind of stipulate adaptation, mitigation, loss and damage, it doesn't have to go through a fund. It's all kind of up to each country how they want to get the money there. But also on the point of having a voice, developing countries having a voice, there's also part of this conversation is, what's a developing country, and is that the same as what's a climate vulnerable country? So there could be conversation about which countries count as donor countries and recipient countries.
I know that's a conversation the small island developing states in particular want to have, right? I mean, obviously led by Barbados and Mia Mottley, their prime minister, who has said, look, we might be a higher income country in Barbados, but we are so climate vulnerable. Countries like us should be in the position to receive funds for adaptation in this new world that we're in. You're right, that's a big debate.
Yeah, exactly.
Ayenat, I know you're covering food systems for us at Devex. So what are you looking at when it comes to COP29?
Yeah, so the last COP, COP28 in Dubai, had a real breakthrough moment in terms of food and agriculture. Because even though food and land use constitutes about a third of greenhouse gas emissions, surprisingly, it's never really been a big topic at these talks. So last year was kind of its debut. And so there was the UAE declaration, which 160 countries tied into, which is non-binding, kind of, some broad goals about pursuing more sustainable agriculture, promoting food security. And there was also a mention of actually integrating food systems language into the NDCs. So that's definitely going to be something we're going to be looking at this COP, the COP29, is the extent to which that language is actually integrated into NDCs and whether people are actually going to follow through on that. And of course, it is still, the finance COP, even within the food systems space. So people are talking about adaptation, especially. So, there's one element of agriculture that we're talking about, which is, obviously industrial agriculture responsible for a lot of emissions, and we have to talk about it in that sense. But there's also, the fact that most farmers in the world are smallholder farmers that are really vulnerable to the effects of climate change. And so we need to be having a conversation about adaptation with the smallholder farmers. And so people are really going to be pushing for financial support, direct financial support for farmers around the world. And so that'll be a big conversation as to whether they get some allocated funds.
That's a good lead in maybe to what I'm often interested in at these COPs. This will be my third COP that I'm attending. And I find that it's the official conversations are important and relevant. I mean, they set a narrative and they set even real policy shifts in many countries. But it's also what happens on the sidelines. Like, a lot of the energy and action is in the private sector. It's with foundations and philanthropies. It's with NGOs. And so you hear a lot of meetings and conversations on the sidelines, and even big announcements of partnerships. You've got to take a somewhat skeptical eye to these things because there's a lot of announcements during something like a COP, and you want to see what's real. But, when it comes to something like the food space, a lot of the biggest players there aren't just governments. They're the giant multinational food companies or the fertilizer companies or energy companies, many others that are in that space. And listening and hearing from them what they're engaged in, listening to the advocacy groups that are on the ground at COP and pushing them, understanding what, if any, new commitments they're making. To me, that's a lot of what's going to be exciting to see in Baku.
Definitely. And I'm sure that we're going to be seeing a lot of exciting announcements, interesting announcements, definitely from the private sector as well. I mean, I know I've already been invited to attend something on green ammonia, which I'm really looking forward to go to, which is talking about how can we make, obviously fertilizer, which is a hugely carbon intensive product. How can we make that a little bit greener? So there will also be lots of side conversations about innovation that will be happening. That will be interesting. Kind of on a darker note, though, one big question that people are really asking is what's going to be the role of fossil fuel lobbyists here? Because last year at Dubai, there was estimates had over 2,000 fossil fuel lobbyists attending. So people are also asking what kind of side conversations are happening here. What will happen here? Because of course, Azerbaijan is a huge oil and natural gas producer. So I know a lot of people are really interested to see as to whether this will also be a backdrop to kind of these, closed door deals in the oil and gas space.
And that lobby has gotten a big shot in the arm by the election results in the U.S. No doubt that was a big theme of the Trump campaign. This whole idea of drill baby drill, and of course in Europe, there's a snap election being called in Germany, and even there's a big debate about they're looking to move their power plants to be hydrogen ready, but they're also debating to what extent they want to keep access to coal power, in this very uncertain national security environment vis-a-vis Russia. So it seems like you're right. These debates are going to be right on in the center of this COP. And of course, it's in a country that is one of the world's major, fossil fuel producers and exporters. So it's hard to avoid that conversation. And it's coming after a COP in Dubai. That is another of the world's great exporters of these products. So, it's hard to avoid it. In a way, maybe it's better that we're looking really squarely at the reality and not imagining it's something different. I'm excited for COP. How are you feeling, Jesse?
Yeah, I'm really excited too. I think it's worth mentioning too that this COP is just so much smaller than past COPs, especially if you compare it to Dubai. And so I do wonder, are we going to see a difference in that sideline activity? Is there going to be less energy? Maybe, maybe not. I think it's still like 50,000 people, but obviously all the discussions around Azerbaijan as the destination has kind of changed the makeup of the group. And so I wonder if we'll see it kind of leaning more on the official side of things, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think you're right. A lot of corporates have said they're skipping. They're going to go to Brazil instead. They're waiting for that COP30. It's hard to know how much of it is sort of geopolitics, just given where Azerbaijan sits geopolitically, how much of it is just how hard it is to get there. And, a lot of corporates who are coming from Europe or the US might say, well, I'd rather go to Brazil. It's a little tricky to know, but my sense is the core, the insiders, the people that are really making big decisions, both officially and in the philanthropic and private sector world, I think they're going to be there. And in some ways, it being a smaller COP, it's going to be easier to actually have conversations and be together as a group. So it may be small, but it may be a really influential convening.
Yeah, I noticed I was kind of going through the schedule, and I think something that we haven't talked about much and I haven't heard much on is there's a lot of I think official discussions on Indigenous rights, which I think if I'm understanding correctly, started as sort of a sideline thing and has over the years become really central and really official. And so I'm also really excited to see what happens there, and if we come out with any kind of solid, agreements on that.
Yeah, that'll be an important one to track as well. Well, I'm looking forward to seeing you both on the ground in Baku before long and bringing our audience there. Thanks for joining us, everybody. This has been another episode of This Week in Global Development.